The explosion did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the moon itself took a breath and decided not to let it go. A deep grinding groan rolled through the rock walls of Tunnel Sector 4 on Velaris 9, and then the ceiling came down. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Like the mountain was making a decision, Sergeant Mara Voss was walking back from the cargo bay when the first shake hit. She had seen cave-ins before. She had survived one before. Her body knew what to do before her brain did. She dropped flat and covered her neck with both arms and pressed herself against the tunnel wall. The lights went out. Dust flooded in like water. She could not see her own hand in front of her face. Then something heavy hit her from above. She did not scream. She did not have enough air to scream. She lay in the dark for what felt like a very long time. She could hear other people. Some were calling for help. Some were not making any sound at all. She tried to move her left arm, and a white-hot pain shot from her ribs up through her shoulder, and she stopped moving. She breathed slowly. In and out. In and out. Her military training had taught her that panic cost oxygen, and oxygen was the only thing keeping her alive right now. The rescue team came 22 minutes later. She counted every one of those minutes. When the Caltheri medics pulled her out of the rubble, she was covered in gray dust and dark blood, and she was still counting. She had reached 1,340. 7 seconds when the bright blue light of a Caltheri medical scanner passed over her chest. And she heard the medic make a sound she had never heard a Caltheri make before. It was the sound of alarm. The Caltheri were insectoid, six-limbed. Their faces were mostly smooth, with large amber compound eyes and thin mouths that clicked when they spoke their own language. In the 3 years that humans and Caltheri had shared the mining colony on Velaris 9, Mara had learned to read their body language fairly well. And what she saw in the medic crouching over her was something very close to fear. The medic called out to another. Then another came. Then 3 more. They surrounded her on the ground and spoke quickly in clipped clicking sounds to each other and pointed at the scanner screen. Mara turned her head slowly and tried to read the screen. She could not. It was in Caltheri script. Then the healer prime arrived. His name was Zezik, and he was the most respected physician in the entire colonial sector. Not just among the Caltheri. Among every species that passed through Velaris 9, he had saved lives that other doctors had already written off. He had performed surgeries so precise and so complex that galactic medical journals had published papers about them. He was tall for a Caltheri with deep green markings along his upper limbs that indicated his rank, and he moved through the crowd of medics with the calm, heavy certainty of someone who had never been wrong. He looked at the scanner. He looked at Mara. He looked at the scanner again. Then he said in perfect standard galactic that she needed emergency surgery. And she needed it now. Mara looked up at him from the ground. Dust in her eyelashes. Blood on her collar. Pain in every breath. She looked at this towering alien physician with his glowing scanner and his ranked markings and his absolute certainty, and she said one word. No. The word dropped into the tunnel like a stone into still water. The medic stopped moving. Zezik's compound eyes stayed fixed on her face. He had heard many things from patients in his long career. Crying, begging, bargaining. He had heard patients ask for their gods. He had heard patients ask to die. But he had never in 40 years of healing heard a patient look at a life-saving diagnosis and say, "No," with such complete and quiet calm. He explained again. His translator rendered his words in clean, precise standard. Her lung had been punctured by a fractured rib. She had internal bleeding in 2 places. And there was an anomaly near her heart. A dense mass of unidentified biological material pressing against the pericardium. If it was not removed immediately, it would cause cardiac arrest within hours. She would die. Not might die. Would die. Mara listened to all of it. She did not look afraid. She did not look confused. She looked like someone who had already heard this information before and had already made her decision about it. She said no again. Zezik straightened to his full height. The medics behind him exchanged looks. The young one called Tlen stepped forward slightly, then stopped himself. He was newer than the others, curious where the others were cautious. He had spent his first 6 months on Velaris 9 reading every piece of human medical literature he could access. Not because he needed to, because humans were strange and strange things interested him. Tlen looked at the human woman on the ground and thought she did not look like someone who wanted to die. She looked like someone who knew something they did. Not. Zezek did not believe in that kind of thinking. He believed in data. He believed in the scanner in his hand, which had never given him a wrong reading. He believed in his own 40 years of experience, which had taken him across 11 star systems and 230 different biological species. He believed in the galactic medical compulsion clause, which existed precisely for moments like this one. Moments when a patient was too injured or too frightened or too foolish to make the right decision for themselves. He told Mara what the clause meant. He told her that aboard a shared colonial station under galactic treaty, a healer prime had the legal authority to override patient refusal in a life-threatening emergency. He told her this was not cruelty. This was the law. This was what the law existed to do. Mara looked at the ceiling of the tunnel for a moment. She breathed carefully around the pain. Then she looked back at Zezek, and her voice was low and steady, and it carried. She said that if he cut her open without understanding what was inside her, she would not survive the table. She said this not as an argument, not as a plea. She said it the way someone states the temperature outside. As simple fact, Zezek formally invoked the clause. He had a medic record it. His tone was not angry. It was the tone of a man doing something necessary and correct and slightly sad. Mara closed her eyes. Lien stood at the back of the group and stared at her face as the other medics prepared the transport stretcher. He had read enough about humans to know one thing with certainty. They did not give up easily. They did not face death quietly. They fought. They scrambled. They begged and bargained and clawed. This woman was doing none of those things. She was still, and somehow that stillness frightened him far more than any scanner reading ever could. The stretcher lifted. The lights of the medical bay waited ahead. Somewhere deeper in the collapsed tunnel, 2 more workers were still being dug out, and someone was crying, and the dust was still settling, and the moon of Velaris 9 kept turning slowly in the dark of space like it had not just changed everything. Mara Voss opened her eyes one more time before they carried her through the door. She was still counting. The medical bay on Velaris 9 was the cleanest room on the entire moon. Everything in it was white or pale blue. The instruments were arranged in exact order. The air was filtered 4 times per hour. The lights never flickered. Zezek had designed it that way himself when the colony was first established. He believed that healing began before the first incision. It began in the environment, in the order, in the certainty that everything around the patient was controlled and known and precise. He stood at the head of the operating table now and looked down at Mara Voss and felt the first faint edge of something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt uncertain. Not because of her injuries. Her injuries he understood completely. The scanner data was clear and his hands were steady, and he had performed procedures far more complex than this one on species, far more fragile than humans. He was uncertain because she was awake. They had given her pain medication and stabilized her breathing with a support mask, but she had refused full sedation. Her eyes were open and they were watching him, and they were completely alert, and that was not how dying patients looked. Dying patients looked inward. They went somewhere else behind their eyes. Mara Voss was entirely present. Tlen stood near the instrument table. He was supposed to be assisting with preparation. Instead, he kept glancing at her face. He had pulled up everything he could find about human physiology in the 20 minutes since they brought her in. Humans were fascinating in ways that made most Caltheri physicians uncomfortable. Their bodies were inconsistent. Their pain responses were unpredictable. Their healing rates varied wildly from individual to individual. Other species had biology that followed clean rules. Human biology read like a document that had been rewritten Too many times by too many different authors. Zezik checked the scanner one final time. The anomaly near her heart was still there, dense, irregular, pressing against the pericardium wall. His diagnosis had not changed. His decision had not changed, he told Mara. They were ready to begin, she spoke before he finished the sentence. She told him that the anomaly near her heart was not a tumor. It was not a growth. It was not biological material of any kind. She said it slowly and clearly so the translator had no trouble rendering it. She said it was a device. The room went quiet the way rooms go. Quiet when something impossible has just been said out loud. Zezik looked at his scanner. The scanner showed dense, irregular mass. It did not show circuitry. It did not show manufactured components. He told her this. She told him his scanner was not designed to read what she had in her chest. She told him that the device was called a subdermal neurocardiac regulator. She told him it was a human military implant, experimental, classified, installed 2 years ago after an incident that had left her original cardiac tissue damaged beyond what standard repair could fix. The implant had kept her alive for 24 months. The filaments from it were threaded through her cardiac muscle at the cellular level. They were thinner than any Caltheri instrument. They could not be seen by any scanner currently in this room. If he cut where he intended to cut, he would sever those filaments. She would go into cardiac arrest within 90 seconds. She would not survive. She said all of this in the same flat, steady voice she had used in the tunnel. No drama, no desperation. Just information delivered by someone who was very tired and in a great deal of pain and had apparently been saving this explanation for exactly this moment. Zezik was silent for 4 full seconds. For a Caltheri physician of his rank and experience, that was an enormous silence. Then he said that no such device appeared in any galactic medical database. He said that no human technology he was aware of could produce something small enough and precise enough to require filaments at a cellular level. He said that what she was describing sounded like a story invented by a frightened patient to avoid a procedure that felt threatening but was necessary for survival. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone being patient with someone they believed was wrong. Mara looked at the ceiling. She breathed slowly. Then she looked back at him. She said she was not asking him to trust human medicine. She was not asking him to believe that humans were more advanced than the Caltheri. She was asking him to accept the possibility that there was one thing in this room that his scanner could not read, and that the one person who knew what that thing was happened to be the patient on his table. She said she needed her emergency kit. It was in her quarters. Locker 7. Inside it was a data chip with her full classified medical file. The file had the implant schematics, the installation records, and a warning flag that any surgeon in any galaxy could read clearly. Zezik looked at Tlan. He did not ask Glenn to go. He simply looked at him the way senior physicians look at junior ones when they want something done that they do not want to officially order. Tlen did not move. Then Zezik turned back to Mara and said that the compulsion clause was still in effect, that her story changed nothing legally, that he was going to perform this surgery because she was dying, and that was what he was here to prevent. One of the other medics began sterilizing the first instrument. Mara did not beg. She did not raise her voice. She turned her head and looked directly at Tlan standing by the instrument table, and she said his name. She had heard the other medics use it. She said it quietly and clearly, and she said one thing to him. She said that she had read about Caltheri medical tradition. She had read that in the old text before the compulsion clause existed. Caltheri healers were required to sit with a patient for 1 full hour before any procedure, just to listen. Not to diagnose? Just to listen. She said she was not asking for an hour. She was asking for someone to go to locker 7. Tlan felt something move in his chest that had no Caltheri medical name. He looked at Zezik. He looked at the woman on the table, with her measured breathing and her steady eyes and the blood drying dark on her collar. He made a decision. He set down the instrument in his hand and he walked out of the Medical bay without asking for permission? Zezik watched him go. His upper limbs were very still. His compound eyes gave nothing away. But the other medics in the room felt it. Something had shifted. Some certainty that had filled the room from floor to ceiling had developed a small and undeniable crack outside in the corridor. Tlen was already moving fast toward the residential block. Behind him, the operating table waited in its clean white light. And Mara Voss lay on it with her eyes open and her hands flat at her sides, and she was still breathing and still counting and still refusing to go anywhere she was not ready to go. Locker 7 was not locked. Tien found that strange. He had expected a human soldier's emergency kit to be sealed behind multiple layers of security. Instead, the locker opened at a simple press, and inside on the bottom shelf sat a flat, gray case no larger than a Caltheri medical satchel. It had human text stamped on the outside. He could read standard galactic well enough to understand it. It said, "Field Emergency Kit, Voss M. Open only when she tells you to." He stood in the corridor with the case in his hands, and read that line 3 times. She had prepared for this. She had written that instruction before the accident, before the collapse, before any of this had happened. She had known that someday someone else might need to open this case, and she had left them a message. Tlen started walking back fast. In the medical bay, Zezik had not moved. He stood at the head of the table with his arms at his sides and his scanner in his hand, and he was staring at the data on the screen with the focused expression of a man trying to find a flaw in an argument he already believed was wrong. The other medics had quieted. They were watching him in the way junior staff watch a superior when they are not sure what is about to happen. Mara was still awake. Her breathing had grown more shallow. Tlen could see it when he walked back through the door. Her body was losing the fight on its own. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it soon. He set the case on the instrument table next to her hand. She turned her head, looked at it. Something in her face changed. Not relief exactly. More like recognition. The way a person looks when they see something they buried a long time ago come back to them exactly when they needed it. She lifted her right hand slowly and pressed her thumb against the small biometric pad on the case corner. It clicked open. Inside was a compact field surgery kit with sealed, sterile pouches. Small tools with worn edges. Human tools. They looked old. Not primitive exactly, but clearly made for practicality and not elegance. There was a folded thermal blanket. There were 3 small injector cartridges with handwritten labels. And there at the back edge of the case sat a slim data chip no bigger than Tlen's smallest finger joint. Black, no markings. Mara picked up the chip and held it out. Her hand was not entirely steady, but her grip was sure. She told Tlen to slot it into the bay's medical display. She said it needed her biometric pass first, and she had already given it when she opened the case. The chip would read the same signal. Tlen took it and walked to the wall display. He slotted it. The screen changed. Human text filled it, and then the translation layer activated and the Caltheri rendering appeared beside it. Zezik moved toward the screen without meaning to. Like something had pulled him. The file was long, technical, dense, but at the top, before any of the clinical data, came a red bordered box. A warning flag. And inside it, the words were short, and they were clear, and they were written in 7 languages, including Caltheri standard medical script. It said, "Neurocardiac regulator implant present. Filament integration full cardiac tissue. Standard surgical interference. Will trigger cascading cardiac arrest. Do not operate without full implant. Schematics and specialist approval. This warning is not a request. Patients have died from." Ignoring IT, the last line was not clinical language. Someone had added it by hand in the original file. Tlen could see the formatting was different. Someone had typed it separately because they wanted it to be felt, and not just read. Patients have died from ignoring it. The medical bay was very quiet. Tlen scrolled down. The schematics came up next. A 3-dimensional rendering of Mara's chest cavity with the implant mapped in detail. The filaments were there in the image rendered in pale yellow. They were everywhere. Not clustered, not contained. They ran through the cardiac muscle like roots through soil. There was no clean path to the anomaly that the scanner had flagged. Every path went through them. Zezik looked at the schematic for a long time. Then he looked at Mara. She was watching him. Not with anger. Not with the satisfaction of someone who has proven a point. She was watching him the way people watch something they hoped would not be necessary. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that the data could be falsified. That human technology was not documented in the galactic database. That there was no way to independently verify the implant existed without the very scan that could not detect it. His voice was different now, quieter. He was not making an argument. He was retreating into one. Tlen turned from the display and looked at his superior. He had admired Zezik for 11 years. He had trained under him. He had watched him save lives that seemed impossible to save. And now he watched him stand in front of proof and look for a reason to not believe it, and Tlen felt something in that admiration start to bend. Mara spoke. She said she was not asking Zezik to trust human medicine. She understood why he did not. Human medicine from the outside looked chaotic and improvised and inconsistent, and she knew that because it was all of those things and more. She was not asking him to believe that humans were more advanced or more capable. She was asking him to accept one simple thing. She said she was the only person in this room who had lived inside her own body for 34 years. She was the only person in this room who had been awake when the implant was installed. She was the only person in this room who felt it working every morning when she got up and every night when she lay down. She was the only person in this room who knew what it felt like when it was functioning and what it felt like when it was not. She said she was not asking him to trust the chip. She was not asking him to trust the file. She was asking him to trust her. She said those last 3 words and then she stopped talking. The silence stretched. Xezzik turned away from the table. He walked to the far side of the bay and stood with his back to the room. His upper limbs moved once in a gesture that Tlen had only seen him make once before. Years ago. After a surgery that had not gone the way it should have. It was the Caltheri gesture for standing at the edge of what you know. Tlen did not wait for an order. He stepped forward and in a voice that was calm and clear and would cost him everything. If he was wrong, he formally suspended the surgery order. He cited the undocumented implant risk. He cited the patient's documented refusal. He cited the Caltheri medical tradition that Mara had named in the operating room. He took professional responsibility for the suspension. Every word was recorded by the Bay's legal log. His career balanced on the next few seconds. Zezik did not turn around. He did not countermand the suspension. He stood at the edge of what he knew and he did not step back and he did not step forward, and the silence of that was its own kind of answer. Tlen turned to Mara. He told her the surgery was suspended. He told her they needed another way. He told her that she was still bleeding internally and that the window was closing and that whatever she knew about her own body she needed to start sharing it right now. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the case still open on the instrument table. Then she looked back at him and something in her face became very focused and very still and very human. She told him to pull up the schematic again. She told him she was going to walk him through it. And from the far side of the room Zezik stood, with his back turned and his arms at his sides, and he did not speak and he did not leave, and in the end that staying was the most important thing he did that night. It did not look like any surgery Tlen had ever performed. Caltheri surgery was a precise thing. It had been refined over 800 years into something that looked less like medicine and more like art. Every movement was planned. Every incision had a name. Every instrument had a single purpose and was used only for that purpose and then set back in its exact position on the tray. There was no improvisation in Caltheri surgery. Improvisation was what happened when preparation had failed. Improvisation was what the lesser species did. Tlen had believed that for his entire career. Now he stood at the table with a half-conscious human woman, guiding his hands through a procedure that had no name in any Caltheri medical text, and he was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about something important. Mara spoke in short sentences. Her voice was low and even, and she paused between instructions to breathe through the pain and then continued. She did not use clinical terminology. She used plain words, practical words. The kind of words used by someone describing something they had rehearsed in their head many times, not because they were a surgeon, but because they had known that one day they might be in exactly this situation, and they needed to be ready for it. She told him where to go. She told him what he would find there. She told him what to avoid and why. She told him when to stop and wait and when to move fast. She narrated her own interior the way someone might narrate a path through terrain they had walked in the dark many times. By feel, by memory, by the kind of knowledge that does not live in books. Tien followed. His instruments were too large for some of what she described. He had to adapt. He used the small curved tool from her field kit for one step because she told him her kit tools were sized for human implant work. He had never used a human instrument before. It felt wrong in his grip, imprecise, like working with something slightly out of focus. But it did the thing it needed to do, and that was all that mattered. The other medics watched in a silence that was not comfortable. This was not how things were done. This violated every procedural standard they had trained under. But Tlen had taken responsibility and Zezik had not overruled him, and so they watched and they handed him things when he asked, and they did not speak. Zezik had moved. He was no longer at the far wall. He had come to stand at the outer edge of the medic ring around the table. He did not come closer. He did not assist. But he watched. His compound eyes moved between the display screen and Mara's face and Tlen's hands. His expression was unreadable. Halfway through the procedure, Mara stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her vitals dropped. Not catastrophically, but fast enough that the monitor beside the table changed its tone from a steady pulse to something with more urgency in it. Tlen looked up at her face. Her eyes had gone to the ceiling. She was still breathing. But the instruction had died on her lips, and the room suddenly felt very large and very exposed. Tlen asked her to come back to him. He used the Kalthari phrase that healers used with patients going under. It translated roughly as "come to the surface." Mara's eyes moved. Found his face. She blinked once, then her monitor changed again. Something else was wrong. The implant, the scanner that could not see its structure, could still detect its energy output, and the output reading had begun to spike and drop in irregular patterns. The power cell inside the implant was destabilizing. The trauma from the collapse had been building damage into it for the past hour, and now it was showing. If it failed entirely, the filaments would go dead. Without their signal, the cardiac tissue they had integrated with would lose its regulatory input. The muscle would not know what rhythm to hold. She would stop. Tlen spoke quickly and told Mara what the scanner was showing. He asked if there was a way to stabilize it externally. He asked if her kit had anything for this. There was a long 4-second pause that felt like falling. Then Mara spoke. Her voice was slower now, softer, but it was there. She told him to look in the left side pocket of the case. Not the main compartment. The side pocket. There was something wrapped in rubber. Copper-colored. She told him it looked like nothing. She told him it looked like something from a broken machine. She told him to get it. One of the other medics found it. They held it up. It was a small hand-wound coil of copper wire wrapped tight in a sleeve of black rubber insulation. It had a stripped end on each side. It was warm from being in the case. It looked like it belonged in a maintenance shed and not a medical bay. The medic turned it over in their hands with an expression that on a human face would have been disbelief. Tlen looked at it. He looked at Mara. She told him it was a bypass conductor. She told him that the implant had an external contact point on the lower left intercostal margin. She described exactly where. She said the coil could be used to feed a stabilizing current from the bay power line into the contact point and hold the cell long enough to finish what they were doing. Gautielien said the word he found for it in plain language. He said it was a wire. She said yes. asked how she had known to put it in the case. How she had known she might ever need something like this in the middle of surgery. On a moon far from any human facility, there was a pause. Then Mara said something that Tlayan would remember for the rest of his life. She said it very quietly because she was tired and because it was simply true, and she was long past the age of dressing simple. True things up, she said that humans had not always had allies. That, for most of their history, they had faced every bad situation alone. No Caltheri physicians. No galactic treaties. No clean white medical bays. Just themselves and whatever they could carry and whatever they could figure out in the dark. She said the wire was in the case because somewhere in the back of her thinking she had always known there might be a moment when the elegant solution was not available. And for those moments you needed the ugly one. She said the ugly ones kept you alive just as well. Tlayan took the wire. He located the contact point where she described it, and the connection was not graceful and it was not precise. And Zezek made a sound from the edge of the room that was almost certainly involuntary, but the monitor steadied and the implant output smoothed, and Tlayan finished the procedure with hands that were not quite steady and a focus that had never been sharper. Took 11 more minutes. When it was done, the room was very still. The monitor held its steady rhythm. Mara's eyes had closed. Not the closing of someone going away. The closing of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. Tlayan stood at the table and looked at his own hands. They were shaking slightly now that the work was done. He had not let them shake during. He had not been able to afford it. He became aware that Zezek was standing beside him. The healer prime looked at the monitor, at the steady line, at the woman asleep on the table who had guided alien hands through her own chest with nothing but words and a wire. He stood there for a long moment, and his upper limbs were very still and his compound eyes were fixed on her face. He did not say anything, but he did not leave either. And outside the medical bay, Velarus 9 kept turning in its slow orbit around a distant star, and the dust in the collapsed tunnel was still settling, and somewhere in the wreckage of Sector 4 the last of the survivors were being found, and the moon did not care about any of it the way moons never do. But in that room something had changed, something that could not be scanned or measured or filed in a medical record, something that had no name in Caltheri, but humans had a word for it. They had always had a word for it. They called it proof. She woke on the third day. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing that most patients did. She opened her eyes and she was present immediately, fully, the way people are present when they have been waiting to wake up rather than simply sleeping. The recovery ward was quiet. It was early by the colony clock. The lights were at their low setting. Tlayan was sitting in the chair by her bed. He had been there for 2 hours. He did not sleep well during recoveries. He never had. He sat with his secondary limbs folded and his primary limbs in his lap and a data pad on his knee that he had not looked at in some time because he had been watching the monitor instead. When her eyes opened, he sat up. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the monitor beside her, then at him. She asked how long. He told her 3 days. He told her the punctured lung was sealed. The internal bleeding had resolved. The implant was stable. He told her that the copper wire bypass was still in place and they were going to need her help to remove it cleanly, but that could wait until she was stronger. She nodded slowly. Then she was quiet for a while, and Tlayan let the quiet be. After some time she asked about XEZZIK. Tlayan was careful with his words. He said that Zezek had reviewed everything. The full medical file, the schematics, the procedure record. He said that Zezek had submitted a formal report to the Colonial Medical Authority that included a complete account of the compulsion clause invocation and the subsequent suspension. He said the report was honest. Fully and unusually honest. Mara turned her head and looked at Tlayan. She asked if Zezek was in trouble. Tlayan said no. He said that the honesty of the report was what protected Zezek. It was also what was going to make the report very difficult for the medical authority to ignore. He paused. Then he said that he himself might be in a different situation. That formally suspending a healer prime's order without counter-authorization was a significant breach of Caltheri medical protocol. That there would be a review. Mara looked at him steadily. She asked if he regretted it. Tien thought about that. He thought about it for a genuine moment and not for a polite one. Then he said no. He said that he had read enough human medical literature to know what informed consent meant. He said that in Caltheri tradition, the healer was the authority on the body, that the patient was the subject of treatment and not a participant in it. He said that somewhere in the back of his thinking he had always felt a discomfort about that. A small and quiet discomfort that he had never had a name for. He said that night in the medical bay, he had found the name for it. Mara was quiet. Then she said she was sorry he was facing a review because of her. He said he was not. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And there was a moment between them that was not romantic or dramatic, but was the kind of moment that happens when two very different people from very different places recognize something true in each other, and neither. One looks away from it. Then Tien picked up his data pad and told her he had been working on something. He had written a paper. He had started it the night after the surgery, during the hours when he could not sleep and the recovery ward was silent around him. He had written it carefully. He had written it in both Caltheri Standard and Standard Galactic. He had titled it on the subject of patient authority and the limits of external diagnosis. He had cited the incident without naming her directly. He had cited her field kit. He had cited the wire. He told her he wanted to list her as a contributor. She stared at him. He said she had contributed more to the paper than anyone. He said the entire argument of the paper rested on something she had said to him in the recovery room on the first day she was conscious. Something he had written down immediately because he could tell it was the kind of thing that should be written down. She asked what she had said. She did not remember the first day clearly. He read it to her from the pad. He read it in his careful, steady voice. She had said, "I am not asking you to trust human medicine. I'm asking you to trust me about my own body." The room was very quiet. Mara looked at the ceiling for a long time. When she looked back, her eyes were bright and she blinked once and pressed her lips together and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said yes. She said he could put her name on it. The paper went to the Galactic Medical Consortium 6 weeks later. It moved through the academic community the way certain papers do when they arrive at exactly the moment the community was ready to be uncomfortable about something it had been ignoring. Within 3 months it had been read and cited and debated and argued over in 14 medical institutions across 9 star systems. 2 Caltheri universities requested Tien presented in person. He went. He took a copy of Mara's field kit schematics with him. He showed the wire. Every time he showed the wire there was silence in the room, then questions. Always questions. One professor asked him how a species as physically fragile as humans had survived long enough to develop space travel. He had heard this question asked dismissively before. This time it was asked with something that sounded like genuine curiosity. Tien said he had asked Mara the same thing. He read her answer from the pad. She had said, "We did it the same way we do everything else. We figured out what we were missing and then we found a way to carry it ourselves." The professor was quiet for a long time after that. The Galactic Medical Compulsion Clause came under formal review 8 months after the paper was published. It was the first time in the clause's 140-year history that it had been formally challenged. The review board included 3 Caltheri physicians, 2 human representatives, and 4 members of other species who had their own long and complicated histories with external medical authority being applied to their bodies without their agreement. The review took a long time. It was not finished quickly. These things never are. But it had started. And the starting was everything. Zezik visited Mara twice during her recovery. The first time he came in and stood by the door and looked at her and left after 30 seconds without saying anything. She did not stop him. She understood that he needed to see that she was alive, and that she had needed to see that he was capable of coming. The second time he came, he sat Down, he sat in the same chair Tlan always used, and he folded his limbs in his lap, and he looked at the window that showed the gray rock surface of the moon outside, and he spoke carefully. He said he had performed 4,217 procedures in his career. He said that in all of those procedures he had never once considered the possibility that the most important information in the room might not be in his scanner. He said that every patient he had ever treated, he had treated as a thing to be corrected, a problem to be solved, a set of readings to be normalized. He said he had called this approach compassion and had believed that completely. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was no longer entirely sure what to call it. Mara looked at him for a long time. She did not offer him forgiveness. She did not offer him reassurance. He had not asked for either, and she respected him enough not to give them. UNASKED. She said one thing. She said that the best doctors she had ever met were the ones who were afraid of being wrong. Not paralyzed by it. Just afraid enough to keep listening. He looked at her. Then he stood. He said nothing more. He left the way he came, but the next morning Tlan found a message from Zezik in the paper's academic submission file. A single line added to the contributor section in Zezik's formal medical registry ID. He had added himself as a reviewer, not as an endorser, not as a co-author, just as a reviewer. Someone who had been present, someone who had seen it, someone who was willing to put their name next to the evidence, even when the evidence made them smaller than they had been before. Tlan. Read it 3 times. Then he saved it on the day Mara Voss was discharged from the Velarus 9 medical bay. She walked out on her own feet. She carried her gray field case in her left hand. The copper wire had been removed and cleaned and returned to the side pocket where it lived. The Locker 7 instructions on the outside were still there. The same quiet human message left for whoever might need it. She crossed the corridor toward the residential block, and Tlan walked beside her, and they did not speak for most of the walk because they were both people who were comfortable with silence. At the junction where their paths split, she stopped and turned to him and held out her right hand. A human gesture. He knew it. He had read about it in his first year of research. He raised his primary limb and pressed it flat against her palm. She looked at him steadily. She said that she hoped the review board treated him fairly. He said he hoped so too. Then he said that, even if they did not, he would not undo what he had done. He said that was the other thing he had learned from the human medical texts, that sometimes the right choice and the easy choice were not in the same room, and you had to be willing to walk into the harder one without being sure what was waiting there. Mara nodded slowly. Then she picked up her case and walked down the corridor. Tlan watched her go. Above them both, the moon of Velarus 9 turned in the cold dark of space. In the collapsed tunnel sector, work crews were rebuilding. The dust had long since settled. The lights were back on. Somewhere in the galactic medical community, a paper was being argued over, and a clause was being reviewed, and a question was being asked that had not been asked before in quite this way. The question was simple. It was, who knows a body better than the one living inside it? It was a human question. It had always been a human question. For most of their history, humans had asked it into empty rooms with no one listening, into triage tents and field stations and broken ships far from any help. They had asked it, and then they had answered it themselves with whatever they had, with training and instinct and copper wire and the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to accept that someone else understood their survival better than they did. Now the galaxy was finally listening. And somewhere in the records of Velarus 9 Colonial Medical Bay, the log still held the timestamp of the moment a human woman with blood on her collar and dust in her eyelashes looked up at the most respected physician in the sector and said, "No, just that. No. One word that turned out to be enough."